Hi, and welcome back to Bounce Forward. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this podcast, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Mostly it's been assumed that female athletes have similar requirements to men in terms of their training and recovery. Yet, thanks to emerging research, we now understand that this is not the case. In fact, women have their own physiological and nutritional needs which should be considered when designing and implementing training programs. One of the more obvious considerations is the menstrual cycle. As Dr. Stacy Sims says, women shouldn't train like men because women are not small men. I don't know about you, but at different times in my cycle, I just can't face high-intensity training. At other times, I'm raring to go. Bring on the burpees. I've never really tracked my cycle and my training and put it all together, but there are so many studies coming out now to support different training methods in different phases of your cycle to improve performance. I really want to get to the bottom of how to train with your menstrual cycle, so I'm very excited to catch up with Dr. Stacy Sims today, an expert in this field. Dr. Sims is an international exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist who aims to revolutionize exercise nutrition and performance for women. She has directed research programs at Stanford and AUT University, focusing on female athlete health and performance and pushing the dogma to improve research on all women. Dr. Sims has published over 70 peer-reviewed papers, several books, and is a regularly featured speaker at professional and academic conferences. Stacy also has her own business, drstacysims.com, where she creates and delivers online learning courses focused on women's training and performance. Welcome, Dr. Stacy Sims, to the Bounce Forward podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I really want to talk about training and our menstrual cycle. So how can our menstrual cycle impact our fitness and training?
So there's a lot of conversation around this, right? And We're seeing, all these generalizations and things. And when we take a step back, the very first thing that we need women to do is understand their own cycle. Because when you understand your own cycle and how your hormones go up and down within yourself, then you can start looking at how you can tailor your training and nutrition to work with your physiology. So when we are looking at it, we know that day one is the first day of bleeding. And the low hormone phase, this is where we have our lower core temperature. We can access carbohydrates well. We have better mojo. We have better motivation. We are more resilient to stress. Our recovery metrics are better. Our immune system is one that will fight virus and bacteria. So there's all of these elements that go with low hormone that allow us to be very robust to stress. And exercise, of course, is stress. So robust to it, meaning that we can take it on, adapt to it, and move forward. After ovulation, we start to have these innate changes. So I'm not, like some women feel bulletproof around ovulation and some women are really flat. And this is just this transient phase of estrogen going up and down and how that affects our mood, our mojo. And then as progesterone starts to come up, we see an inherent change in our immune system where we're more pro-inflammatory. We see a change in our resting heart rate and our respiratory rate. So resting heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, and this is just at rest. And we see an increase in our core temperature. We see changes in our metabolism. And all of these are in line with let's develop this great endometrial lining to have a really fantastic environment for an egg that will be fertilized. So we're looking at that from a training and nutrition perspective. Our calorie and protein needs go up, and we need to supply more carbohydrate for our training if we're going to try to do any kind of intensity. And then when we look at about the 5 days before our period starts, this is where those hormones peak and then drop off. And in that transient phase of those hormones dropping off, we start to see all these other changes. So there's greater inflammation. There's significant mood changes. So we'll see women who are really anxious or depressed, or if they have a lot of PMT, a lot of issues there. So we see the body's not as robust to stress then. So this is where we tell people, this is, we want to look at it as a deload. So if we overlay a typical periodization model over the menstrual cycle, then we can see there's a good 3-week block of build and change, and then a week of deload. But again, the key part is understanding how your hormones affect you, because we have this general schematic of how physiology works. But someone might be really flat on day 7 and someone else might be really bulletproof. So you can't tell them to do the same thing, right? So
yes, and that's what we're seeing a lot in the media at the moment, when you should be training, when you shouldn't be training.
Yeah.
So is it really important to track your menstrual cycle and to integrate that into your training program?
I say yes. And I say that, and I will caveat it where I might be responsible for all the media conversation about generalizations and specificity. Because when I'm looking at it, originally I was like, okay, these are all the changes that are happening. So if a woman wants to really build strength and endurance and be robust, she wants to build it when her stress levels are low, and physiologically these things are happening. And then when things start to change and we start to see all these compromises in immunity, we might want to look at it this way. And then somewhere along the line, media picked it up and is like, you have to do this in your low hormone and this in your high hormone. And it's absolutely not about that. So with that caveat, it's really important for a woman to track her menstrual cycle so that, one, she knows if she is having changes in it. So if we start to see changes in the length or the bleed pattern, it's a really good internal check to say, hey, wait a second, something's going on here. Like, am I under stress? Am I anovulatory? Am I getting sick? Some of those kinds of things are really well ingrained in the menstrual cycle. But the other thing about tracking it is then you really begin to identify your own unique patterns, like when you're feeling flat, when you're feeling bulletproof. Because so many women will go and take a high intensity class and go, oh my God, I feel awful. What did I do? I didn't recover well. I didn't sleep well. I didn't eat well. And in fact, it's every day during her cycle, that particular day, she feels that way, but hasn't really realized it because she hasn't been tracking. The other thing about tracking is then we can start to see our sleep patterns and how our sleep patterns change, right? Because we know that sleep and sleep architecture change across the menstrual cycle too. So we see after ovulation, when we start to get to the peak of progesterone, our core temperature is up, we start to see less and less of that slow wave sleep, and we start to see more awakenings. So just being aware of that, you can plan for better sleep hygiene or better sleep quality so that your sleep architecture changes aren't going to affect your daily life. So it's like an inherent blueprint for a woman to follow and understand how she's interacting and responding to her fitness and other environment.
That's incredible. I didn't realize that about our sleep and our menstrual cycle. That is powerful info. That is so amazing, because I know for myself, I often feel really blah at certain times through my cycle when I'm doing high intensity training. Would that coincide with lack of sleep as well? Like, it would all be revving up and affecting it.
Yeah. So a lot of times I'll have athletes, and remember, I call anyone who exercises on purpose an athlete, track their sleep metrics across their menstrual cycle, but not paying attention to what the wearable feeds back, because those algorithms are based on male physiology. So what I want women to see is, okay, what is my sleep pattern? Did I have more awakenings? How did I feel? And looking at like heart rate variability and all those kinds of things, but not letting that impact how they feel in training and their performance. Because we'll start to see as estrogen comes up, it's tightly tied to neurotransmitters and serotonin and melatonin and dopamine. So you're having changes in neurotransmitters. And then with your progesterone increasing your core temperature, you get to a point where you'll oscillate right between awakening and sleep, because you have to drop your core temperature in order to get into a deep sleep. And then natural awakening is when your core temperature comes up. So if your internal core temperature is up by 0.5 degrees C, then your threshold for getting into that deep sleep is reduced. So women who might sleep hot, they might have more muscle mass and tend to feel hot all the time. Then when they get to the peak of progesterone, then they're oscillating. They'll have a lot of sleep wake-ups and a longer sleep onset time. And then that feeds forward to, I might have been in bed for 8 hours, but I didn't actually get a really good quality sleep. So they'll feel sluggish and lethargic.
with hormones, they're so powerful, and we're talking about the menstrual cycle, but it's also really important, I think, and I get asked this all the time, to talk about menopause a little bit, and when your hormones change then as well. So your hormones change dramatically during menopause. Should your training change as well, the way you train?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we look at sex hormones and we think about puberty, right? And I say that because my daughter's 11. I'm looking right at the elementary school and stuff, and you see all these changes. And you see that divergent change where all of a sudden the girls look and act completely different than they did when they were just 2 years younger. It's because these hormones have an effect on every system in the body, right? So we talk about the moody teenager, but then when you bring it forward to perimenopause, menopause, the same thing's happening, right? So we're seeing that every system in the body is affected by estrogen, progesterone. But what's happening when we get to perimenopause is because we're having such a change in the amount of estrogen to progesterone. So we're having more and more anovulatory cycles, so we're not producing as much progesterone. We might have times of estrogen dominance. Our receptor sites for these hormones decrease in their sensitivity. So not only are we having changes in the ratios and the absolute amounts of these hormones, we're also having changes in how the body works with these hormones. We're also having changes in our gut microbiome that allow these hormones to actually be shot back out into circulation and to work well. So when we're thinking about training, we have to think about an external stress that is going to cause a signal of adaptation the way these hormones used to. And I often use the example with estrogen, because we know that estrogen is a women's anabolic hormone. But it's not just about muscle protein synthesis. It's also about how strong the muscle contraction is and how the muscle fibers actually bind together. Because estrogen is tightly tied to myosin, and you have the two contractile proteins, myosin and actin. And actin and myosin bond and pull together to create a muscle contraction. So if we have these times when estrogen is low or times when estrogen is high, how strong that bond is changes. So we lose strength. So it's not just lean mass that we're losing. We're also losing the ability to create a strong muscle contraction. In conjunction to that muscle contraction, we also see that estrogen is responsible for how much acetylcholine are in these little vesicles right near the gap junction. So when we talk about a nerve conduction, a nerve is stimulated, and that impulse has to cross the gap junction in order to stimulate muscle fibers to contract. And what allows that nerve impulse to cross is acetylcholine. So if we have a reduction in the amount of acetylcholine because we don't have as much estrogen, there's not a strong signal to make those muscles contract. So we're losing strength, we're losing power, and we're also losing total amount of lean mass because of these changes in estrogen. But if we look and say, if we're doing heavy resistance training and we're bringing it back down to power-based training, it's a complete central nervous system response. Because now the nerves are like, I have to be able to make that muscle contract fast, and I have to make it be able to have a very strong contraction. So it increases the amount of acetylcholine. It changes how actin and myosin bind together, so it makes it a very strong contraction. And because you're having the central nervous system response for power and speed, you don't lose lean mass, but you get an internal response to keep developing and maintaining the integrity of that lean mass. And all of that occurs without estrogen.
Wow. Yes. And that's why you have to lift heavy.
Yes.
Lift heavy. Yes. Amazing. And so many women are resistant to that because they think it's going to make me look bulky or it's going to, what do you say to that? It's just such a myth.
It is such a myth because when you look at the images of women who are bulky, so you're seeing physique competition, you're seeing right now with the CrossFit Games going, those women have to work extremely hard to get that muscle bulk. You have to eat a lot, you have to not do any cardio, and you have to be in the gym concentrating on building mass. And most women, I'd say about 98% of women who are active do not do that. They're like, skip a meal, they might not eat as much, they'll add in some sprint stuff on top of their resistance training, and they just don't have the environment to build that muscle, nor do they have the physiology or hormone profile to get bulky. So it is an incredible myth that stems from when you had the strong women competition back in the early 1900s, where you're having all these really strong women in the circus atmosphere. And people are like, oh, well, if we lift, we're going to be part of the circus. And so that historical idea kind of wove its way into resistance training. And that's not the ideal, quote, ideal woman in society images. So it's that myth that's perpetuated that if you lift heavy and you do resistance training, then you belong in a circus.
Yeah. That's unbelievable. That's crazy, isn't it? So going back to our menstrual cycle, is there a ultimate time to burn fat when you're menstruating? Like, is there to concentrate on weight loss?
No, there isn't.
Okay.
And that's, because when we look from a physiological perspective, the body is not a linear algorithm. In order to get into more beta oxidation or fat burning, you have to go through carbohydrate. So when people are like, oh, I'm going to do fat burning or I'm going to do fasted exercise, it's actually counterproductive, especially in women. Because when we are looking at low carbohydrate intake or we're looking at fasted training or low carbohydrate training, our liver, which also has estrogen receptors and glucose sensors, is like, hey, wait a second, there's not enough glucose circulating to actually allow the body to work this way. So what it does is it increases the amount of blood glucose and shuts down fatty acid from getting into the mitochondria. You need a little bit of blood glucose to stop that effect in order for you to actually get into greater beta oxidation. So what I mean by that is women are already metabolically flexible. And if we're looking to lose weight, it's not about restricting calories or carbohydrate around training. It's about doing the right kind of training, fueling for it, and then taking away maybe 150 to 200 calories at night so that you're having a slight calorie restriction. You're going to get better sleep because you're going to get more into a parasympathetic response without as full of a stomach. And then you wake up going, I need some food. So it becomes a better circadian rhythm of intake, as well as working with the way that your body wants to work and with a fueling mechanism.
That is excellent. And that is a simple way of thinking about it as well. If you just eat a little less at night and fuel your body for exercise, don't starve it. I think that is just a game changer for everyone's performance.
Because what people forget is when they don't have fuel on board for their exercise, the first thing that goes is lean mass, because it's a very metabolically hungry tissue. And for women, when women are in a fasted state, the body's looking to conserve and shut down things. So the first thing that it's going to rip into is metabolically hungry tissue to break it down, to provide building blocks, to keep the brain going, to keep the heart going, to keep the lungs going. So we see, a shutdown of endocrine system. We see this loss of lean mass. We see an increase in body fat. And the more women are experiencing that, unfortunately, the more it drives them to do fasted or low carb or restricted calorie training. And it just becomes this vicious circle where they're not going to get to where they need to be because their body is fighting back inherently.
Yeah. And the body will always fight back.
Yes.
It will always.
Because it's trying to survive.
Yeah, it is. It's always just trying to survive. Thank you so much, Stacy, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
That was great talking to Dr. Sims. So much to think about around our periods, our sleep, and training. Bottom line though, don't overthink it. There are so many myths surrounding diet and exercise. We don't want to overcomplicate it by stressing out about our menstrual cycle too. So keep it rolling. If you're feeling it throughout your period, then go for it. Or if you want to go slower and lighter when you're premenstrual and want to maximize strength and power training from the second day of your period, then you can do that too. Listen to your body. I think that's the most important takeaway here. We track our sleep, our food, our training, but why not track our periods too in relation to our training and performance? I'm going to give it a go. So thank you so much for listening to Bounce Forward today. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on your podcast app. And thanks again for tuning in. Happy days.